Hello, everyone. My name is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to peoplesinternetradio.com, one of the major voices of truth in our world.
Good evening, and welcome to Enemy Within on peoplesinternetradio.com. Sorry for the brief pause there. I'm having a few problems with my mouse tonight. But I'm joined tonight by Tom and Paul, our financial insider. How are you doing, fellas?
Hello, Andy. Fire 2 at the start of the show.
Yeah, well, they couldn't hear us last time.
Yeah, I'm doing fine as well, thanks.
Just talking about Christmas shopping. It's probably what got us sidetracked. I was just saying to Paul that I imagine it's a lot nicer Christmas shopping than it is in the UK. In Holland.
Yes, I guess it is. Right.
So, have you not got the internet where you live then, Tom?
Oh, we're still on dial-up.
It feels like it here, I can tell you. So, where would you like to start tonight, Paul?
Okay, well, I guess we'll start off with some kind of intel in inverted commas I got, yesterday morning, early hours, but I didn't pick it up until probably about 7 a.m. And obviously I put it on the Facebook page, but I'll read it out for the benefit of the audience and anyone else who may not have heard it. And essentially went like this. It said, "The plug has been pulled. Let the show begin. Have been alerted accordingly to that effect this morning at 4 a.m. It will get incredibly ugly. The annihilation of entire groups of people within the corrupt and criminal systems will be unimaginable to normal people, as these systems will be totally dismembered and crushed, never to be resurrected. The cabal is being dragnet caught and being exterminated, as are all their helpers and collaborators. The effects of this event-driven scenario will become visible to the ordinary people in early 2016. So it was pretty brief, pretty concise. So naturally, my first sort of question regarding this is, okay, we've always been kind of waiting for the moment when we saw affirmative action that the cabal would be dealt with. Now, at this stage, I don't know entirely who's responsible for taking out this action. What I do know is that it will be in totality, and it's on a global, worldwide scale, where the cabal will be dealt with. I have had people asking me, what do I mean by it will get incredibly ugly? Well, with all these things, the risk is, of course, we will have an implosion of the financial system. That will then, in turn, of course, create social problems. Forget the economic side of things. Clearly, without a financial system, supermarkets won't function. The transport system to transport food won't function. So clearly, we're going to have some major disruption. For how long at this stage, nobody's sure about. That's kind of up in the air. But it's the first time I've actually had a date where someone said, look, it's now happening. The process is underway. We're going to start to see some small events that will be obvious to people who are awake and aware of what's going on. But to the average person in the street who remains oblivious to what the cabal is or there's any other problem other than what they imagine it to be, it will become obvious in early 2016. Now, what does early 2016 mean? I guess, and I'm guessing here, by the way, I'm not putting a date on it, maybe January, February time, something will happen then where no one will be in any doubt that something's happened. And that was the basis of it, and as I said, I got that, I read it about 7 a.m. yesterday morning, my time. And of course, I put it on my Facebook group, and it's generated a lot of interest, and thank you for everybody who's contributed to that and has appreciated the post. And I guess that's a good starting point. So, and as we're going to make this evening a kind of round-table chat rather than any great sort of formula to what we're doing, then I guess we can fire away from that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering from, obviously, your expert opinion, what you think is meant by that statement. From what we've talked about in the past, you've talked about Russia and China basically taking over the financial system. But I'm thinking, are Russia and China ready to pull the rug, so to speak, and install things that are going to collapse the system? Is it ready? Is it at that stage to make major moves which are going to unseat people across the current global cabal?
Well, what I do know for definite, they have really solid contingency plans in place, which is probably not just the AIIB, the BRICS, and all the financial system, their alternative to SWIFT, etc., etc. They do have contingency plans in place, which to buffer themselves. Now, I've had a lot of discussions with people as to what's going on in the West, and there's people saying, well, there are plans in place to mitigate things, but, say in Europe or mainland Europe and the UK, etc., but nobody's absolutely certain what they are. Now, clearly, if there was nothing in place, that poses a huge problem. But what I do understand is, as one financial system basically would be decapitated, the alternative financial system, which is probably obviously relates to Russia and China, will come on board. Now, how quickly that gets rolled out to the West is a good question, which nobody at the moment is prepared to answer, and I can't give any answer because, truthfully, I don't know. And that's the big quandary we have, because if there's any long period of time without a recognisable financial system, then obviously we know that's going to create this incredibly ugly situation. Obviously, if we get updates as to what's going on, then we can, address that accordingly. But at the moment, that's very much up in the air, which isn't very helpful to the average person in the street, of course.
Okay, so since you received that notice, have you heard any more, or is it all very quiet at the moment?
Well, I went back naturally and said, okay, what do you mean by the annihilation of entire groups of within this kind of cabal structure? And they confirm, yes, it will be in totality. The cabal and all their helpers and collaborators are no longer going to be able to function and do what they've done. Now, obviously, then I said, well, okay, what sort of events are we likely to see? I guess we may start to see people being arrested and effectively disappearing from public view. Whether it's announced that so-and-so has been arrested or not remains to be seen. We're going to continue to see these kind of dislocations in the financial system. Bank runs, for example. I've talked before about the price of oil. Well, it's now below 40, and if it stays below 40 for any period of time, that's likely to have serious implications for the financial system. So we're definitely, without doubt, likely to see those sort of events, which may be small. They're probably not going to be some big US bank going down or some major announcement at the Federal Reserve of serious problems. It's probably likely to be fairly low-key. But I'm now, obviously, from now on, going to keep my eye out for any of these small events that may happen. And obviously, if I become aware of something and I think it's relevant, then I'll obviously let everybody know that this is one of the small events we're likely to see. But I was told to expect to start to see the things that the likes of us would recognise pretty soon, which means maybe in a matter of days or so. So that's the problem of not really knowing exactly what we're going to see. And I wasn't privy to that information or given it, and probably that's a good idea, because whilst it's good to know at a high level what's going to happen, knowing the specific detail is not really of any benefit and not something I could obviously divulge anyway.
Mm-hmm. So something I've noticed of late is there's a certain Mr. Tony Blair who seems to be drawing an awful lot of press attention at the moment, and he seems like there's a slight chance that he might actually be held accountable for his crimes against humanity. Do you think that's the case, or is that possibly just a bit of a distraction there, Paul?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, there's no doubt the argument will be, well, where does he fit into the structure of things, and what is he accountable for? I mean, the obvious things everyone always refers to is obviously war crimes relating to Iraq. But who knows what else he may or may not have been involved in. I don't know. It's impossible to comment on that. But is he likely to be one person who's on the radar? Well, yes, I'm sure there's lots of previous prime ministers who will fall into that category. I mean, it's how long and broad this is open to conjecture and speculation, but I think we're likely to see a lot of people who fall into the cabal structure who will be under investigation and have been. This is not something where they're just going to randomly pluck people and arrest them. We're looking at a situation where these people have been under surveillance for a long time. And this is part of this process that's been ongoing behind the scenes, where people have been under surveillance, investigations have been ongoing. It's not just where we've talked about the big banks have been under investigation. individuals have also, and there was always going to come a point where this process of saying, well, we're going to end the cabal and all the people involved in it, then therefore at that point in time, we've now reached that culmination of all this activity, and we're now, as they said, the show has begun.
That's a really interesting point, Andy, which I didn't think about myself. Tony Blair, and we spoke many times about this on the podcast, and I've said myself that the only outcome of the Chilcot inquiry is a massive investigation into Tony Blair, or Tony Blair going on trial anyway and being put in jail for what he's done. And through that, because Tony Blair's been involved in so many financial institutions and the cabal across the world, then that opens up. It opens the door to investigating all of his past after what they're investigating now.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, this will apply to all people who are either directly involved in the cabal at high level or lower level, or as they say, helpers and collaborators. I mean, the investigation, there might be a number of obvious situations where it's pretty damning, the evidence against whoever it might be. But then, undoubtedly, the investigation will be long and drawn out and protracted, because undoubtedly there will be people involved in all sorts of things that we don't even know exist. And undoubtedly there will be certain people, whoever they may be, who are part of that process. So that's where it will get incredibly interesting to find out the things they were involved in that we never knew about. But also, we might actually find that certain people who we think are serious cabal players may actually turn out to be Trojan horses who've done an awful lot of good for humanity. So I think we might be in for a few surprises as well.
We've got
I think if you look at Tony Blair, he's took up many roles since he left as Prime Minister. And he doesn't seem to have done a lot in a lot of those roles. They seem like a false role, like Middle East peace envoy. He seems to have done zero in that role. It seems like a disguise for doing something else. So that's why I'm saying it opens the whole Pandora's box to what he's actually been doing over these years.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I mean, who knows how? There's wheels within the cabal, as we know. So it's difficult to assess what he's subsequently done or hasn't done. But yeah, I think in a broader context, because it's a global initiative, then also we're going to start to probably better understand how the whole structure hangs together eventually. Because as much as we think we know how it operates, we don't really, as much as we perhaps imagine we do.
Mm-hmm. It would be the perfect disguise. You know, you put the major players in roles, or so-called roles, and they're actually doing something else. They're carrying out some sort of other role financially.
Oh yes, undoubtedly. Yeah, that is absolutely the case. Well, I mean, it comes back to the point of who really runs the Federal Reserve, and everyone thinks it's a public entity, and of course it isn't. It's a private entity run by private banks. So that's just one small example of how the so-called smoke and mirrors approach to how the cabal operates. So, yeah, undoubtedly there'll be people put into roles who actually do something very, very different, but from a public perspective, perception, it's entirely different.
Andy, I think you had a question from the chat room.
Oh, I was just going to say, we've got a prediction in the chat room, which I think stands a fair chance of being bang on. Ken's suggesting that Tony Blair is about to catch dementia.
Well, who knows? I don't think it's possible. But I think...
sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Carry on. No, I was going to...
No, I'm going to go under a totally different subject, so you're going to have to...
Oh, no, well, I was likewise thought we could kind of move on slightly from part of this communication that was said to me. I've also had, of course, a lot of people saying, well, what should I do? And because, in this situation, what do I need to do? And a lot of people, have said, well, is this the time when I need to stock up on food and put provisions aside and make some contingency in case we do have outages of power or the entire financial system goes down? And yeah, I think people do need to be aware of that and to make some provision. But I don't want to kind of frighten people equally, because there is a big unknown around this. Yes, it could be incredibly ugly for a week or 2 weeks or longer. I don't know. To be honest, if I knew, then I would certainly say so. But I don't think it does any harm for people to make some provision. And also to be aware that as people who are awake and aware of what's going on, if we do have this scenario, your people around you who know nothing are going to panic. They are going to look like the rabbit in the headlights, and they're going to look to somebody to give them some assurance as to what they should be doing and to make them aware of what's going on. And this is where everyone out there who is in that position and knows these things can be extremely useful as to help and assist those people around them. So it will engender a more community feel within whether it's the UK or anywhere else for that matter. And that is an important part of this, because if it does get incredibly ugly for a week, 2, 3 or 4 or however long it is, then that becomes paramount and of importance that everybody does work together.
Well, what I was going to say is, like I said at the beginning, when the statement was read out, what you received, I'm just looking myself or thinking what possible thing could start the domino effect. And the only major thing that I could think of would maybe be the dollar being unseated as the reserve currency and being overtook by the yuan.
Well, that's an ongoing process, and it is gathering momentum. Whether that will happen, if we take this scenario that this event-driven scenario will become visible to everyone within, let's say, 3 months from now, for argument's sake, then that's probably not likely to have reached that sort of culmination of dethroning it. But of course, if the financial system collapses, then all fiat currencies will collapse, and so will the dollar. For that matter, arguably so will the yuan and so will the ruble. But of course, if they have the contingency in place, they'll be able to bring it all back online, and they have huge, enormous reserves of gold and other assets to back their currency. And then that becomes the argument of, well, does the US have any gold? Well, from my perspective, no, they don't. So, but in terms of what's a sort of catalytic event, at some point we're going to see bigger and bigger dislocations in the financial system. I mean, that's a point to make. Don't take any notice of what the Dow's doing, or the FTSE's doing, or any other index, or what the currencies are doing. Or, as much as I make a play on what the price of oil is, yes, it's kind of interesting, but it's being manipulated. It's not really worth focusing too much on those metrics. The bigger interesting point that we see all the time is that the macroeconomic things is we're seeing big businesses suffer. Their profits are down. They're laying people off. And all the macro industrial factors are proving the point that the whole globe is contracting. It's economically weak. China isn't weak compared to the West, but it is weaker than it was, but it's still incredibly stronger than, say, the US or the UK. Russia does have some financial internal problems, but it can ride the storm. So we may start to see bank runs in, say, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, those kind of nations. We may start to see some major financial dislocations to do with bond markets, perhaps, or something of that nature. Hard to predict, because at the moment everything's being propped up, but at some point, if we start to see the annihilation of these groups and we start to see the removal of people from the financial sector, then those who are propping up and holding up may fall into that group, and then the whole thing will just collapse. I think the point where it become obvious to everyone is when the whole thing implodes, and rather like 2008 when they bailed all the banks out and shouldn't have, this time there won't be anyone to bail anything out, and that's when the implosion happens, and that's when it becomes obvious to everyone. But between now and that point, whether it's 2 months, 3 months, whatever it is, we can try and look out for some telltale signs of what's going on, and I'll do my best to try and identify those and alert everyone as to what they are. But it's going to be quite difficult to know, because there are so many problems already that are very obvious but aren't actually pulling the financial system down, because the cabal are trying their damnedest just to prop it up basically with algos, which is algorithms. So someone sat there with a computer just buying stock in a completely fraudulent way. There's no actual liquidity to it. There's no reality to it. But they just prop the market up, which is why you see some horrendous economic news and the markets head north. But at some point, that process will no longer work, and we will see huge. That's a possibility. For example, we may see the indices start to fall hundreds of points every day. or maybe 200-300 points a day for two or 3 weeks and start to see, then you might start to say, hang on, now we're starting to see the dislocation working in the market. But at the moment, there's a lot of volatility, but it's gone down slightly, but not greatly from recent record highs as we've seen.
How quickly would the stock exchange collapse? How long can it hold out against losses like that every day, 300 points a day?
Well, the thing is that what they'll do is that normally, if it happens day after day, they'll just close the markets and try and stabilise them. But it will be useless because they can try and close it for a short period. They'll try and stabilise things, and they can't stabilise it. I mean, they do have kind of stabilisation committees and people who operate in the market to try and stop massive crashes. But at some point, they won't be able to stop that. No matter what they do, you could see kind of flash crashes, which are sustainable, not where they kind of sawtooth and drop massively and then spike back up. You'll just see, effectively, you could see, say, I don't know, the Dow drop 800 points in about 2 hours. Because the reality is there's no little liquidity in the market, so any sort of move south of any sort of substance will see huge drops like that. And they'll try and prop it up and try and present the argument there's nothing wrong, but clearly at that point they'll have lost control, and there will come a point where you will see some spectacular crashes, and you may actually see the markets go offline for longer than an hour or 2 or 3, and you might see them out for a day, and that'd be an obviously huge warning sign that the end's nigh, so to speak.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that obviously they'd put, if it dropped so much in one day, then they would pull the rug on the stock market, close it down for that day. But if this problems are still in place, which there would be, then it's just going to drop the next day and the next day. They can't just keep it closed every day. It has to be reopened. No, it's going to fall again. So how long can it hold out for, reopening? It can only do it a few days, surely.
Oh, yes, it wouldn't be very long. I mean, when we reach that capitulation point, then it will happen very, very quickly. It could be day 2, 3 at the most, and of course all hell will break loose as we know. And the markets are largely propped up, as we know, but there's an element of investor confidence. And the problem, of course, is when the real investors start to realise what's really going on and try and bail out, and they won't be able to bail out. They'll just watch the price fall on individual stock basis, forget indices or whatever else. And they'll be powerless to do anything because they won't be able to sell anything. And that's the thing, that the fear and the panic will spread rapidly. And it could be a matter of days where that would be maybe where this kind of culmination of this event-driven scenario happens. And we see the capitulation, and that's when it becomes obvious to everyone. This is 2008, but this time it's 2008 on steroids to the factor of 1 million or something like that, for want of a crude analogy.
Like you said, China, Russia, all of the people outside of the Western cabal that are set up for the collapse a lot better than the West are. They've got gold reserves. Russia survives anything, anywhere. So they could pull a move and survive it very well and come out the victors. But the reason that I was asking earlier on, I'm like, what is it? There must be something on the horizon, because the only thing I can think of is the reserve currency, because there have been talks month after month, November, and then there's back and forths within the media saying it's not going to take over the reserve currency. It is going to take over the reserve currency. But surely you must see things in the media that you say possibly could be the catalyst, the one thing that's going to start the domino effect.
Well, I think it's always good at these points to take a kind of step back. The implosion and this kind of reset in the financial system has been going on since 2008 when Lehman's went down. It's been a battle between the cabal to try and prop it up. I think it's worth pointing out, everyone said, the cabal engineered 2008. Well, no, they didn't. And if they'd really wanted to crash the financial system and impose one world everything, they could have done it then. They simply didn't do it because they were caught, with their trousers down when this happened. They had no idea it was going to happen, and this is why they went into full-blown panic and had to pass all these extraordinary measures to keep the banks afloat, because they were hours away from financial implosion. And that's the thing. It doesn't have to kind of relate to China and the yuan becoming the reserve currency. It could literally be that this time we will have a major financial crisis in the banking system. Except this time there won't be anything to prop the banks up. There won't be any kind of the cabal being able to salvage anything. It will just go down, and when the banking system collapses, that's your catalytic event where that's implosion. And at that point, of course, when the entire financial system grinds to a halt, then obviously the entire world knows what's going on. But equally, that's the point when this contingency plan that Russia and China and undoubtedly other nations have would kick in, and they would be able to roll out. This is why they have an alternative to SWIFT, because they'll be able to carry on with payments. They'll be able to carry on with their banking system without, there'll be some disruption, undoubtedly, but it won't be an implosion for them the way it will be in the West. So I'm less inclined to think it's to do with the reserve currency, because the dollar will just die anyway. When the Western financial system goes, the cabal collapses, so with it goes the dollar as the reserve currency. It would just be a kind of seamless act in that respect. But as specifically what's going to happen, yes, it could be the banks. We could see a nation collapse, and with it, of course, because of all their sovereign debt and how it's linked to banks. It's a bit like Greece. When Greece went down, the debt was one thing, but it was all the derivatives associated with it, where people were betting on Greece failing. Well, when someone wins the bet, someone loses the bet, and those on the other side of losing the bet would create this kind of systemic failure within the financial system, which would have brought the entire Western financial system down with it, because when Greece defaults, so did France, and when France defaults, so does Germany, and ultimately if Germany goes down, the whole European Union goes down. Whereas similarly with the banks after 2008, inexplicably they lassoed all the banks together financially. So if one major bank goes down, they all go down, which is why they've had all these secret bailouts going on since 2008, probably trillions of dollars, just to prop them up, to ensure that very thing didn't happen. But of course, now the cabal's very weak, and that weakness is extending by the day. Of course, when this plan to remove the cabal comes into effect, there's going to be nothing to stop their financial system collapsing. So I'll say it's difficult to know, but I'll keep an eye out as best I can as to what I think might be early warning signs. But I think we're seeing enough anyway in the financial system that are kind of macro indicators as to that basically the entire Western nations are now economically very weak. Even nations like Germany are seeing huge reduction in their exports. They're having internal problems. They're having to lay off staff. They're having to, big companies are certainly, their profitability is reduced. So undoubtedly we are seeing those events, but they're not catalytic events in their own right. But of course you can have accumulation of 100, 200 of these smaller events, which becomes a major event. And that's also a possibility. So not trying to be evasive, but it is very difficult to kind of nail your colours to the mast and say, this is absolutely what's going to bring it about. But maybe a week or 2 or 3 down the line, it may become more obvious then as to what that catalytic event specifically might be.
We got a post a few minutes ago in the chat room. I think it was from Jeff, and he said rather than a bailout, we're told it's going to be a bail-in next. Can you explain for us, not particularly clued up financial people, what the difference is, if there is any difference indeed, Paul, please?
Well, ultimately, there is. All the bail-in is that basically they will steal money from people within, like the likes of you and me, to keep the bank going. And the bailout is when they just print money and prop up the banking. A bank, which is, of course, is what the bailouts were in 2008. They just printed it effectively, in inverted commas, all this funny money backed by nothing to keep the banks afloat. With a bail-in, they'll start to say, oh, well, we've got negative interest rates, so if you want to keep your money in the bank for us, we will charge you interest, and therefore, based on how much money you have, we'll start to take money off you. But the bail-in won't happen. It's absolutely this. It's been long since projected that this was a possibility, but given where we are now, if they were going to do it or try to do it, they would have already done it. I mean, we do see negative interest rates in nations, but we're not seeing any evidence of this so-called bail-in. And a bail-in of what? What exactly, how much money do they think they can seriously make in an average bank from bail-ins? I mean, even on a negative interest rate of, 0.5% or 1%, it's just not realistic. It's more a kind of scare tactic, and the reality is I would be extremely surprised to see that happen there.
I did see somebody had asked after you made that post on your group, what should they do with all their money in the bank when it all goes pear-shaped? And I'm thinking, hang on, isn't that a bit like shutting the door after the horse is bolted?
Yes, it is. But equally, if I'd have acted on the theory back into, I mean, in 2010 it was pretty obvious from my privileged perspective of working in the industry, of knowing that this day was going to come. But, if I'd have acted then and said, I'm going to draw every penny out of the bank and stick it under the mattress, it just would never have made sense. So you have to keep a sense of proportion that whilst we still operate under this system and we have to pay bills and we have financial obligation, we have to continue to operate as such. And we're not really going to get a warning that says, well, in a couple of days the financial system will crash, so draw all your money out now. That's why we come back to this point of why people should, and I appreciate everyone's financial circumstances are different, and some people can obviously don't have any disposable income, which is obviously a problem, and that's pretty widespread, particularly, we know that from the UK and the US and other nations in Western Europe. But if you can afford to buy some, maybe silver, particularly, which is cheaper, or maybe a bit of gold, then do so, because that will give you some insurance against whatever's coming. I mean, I would advocate doing that. I've done it myself, so I'm not telling people to do anything I haven't done myself, obviously. But yeah, you can't kind of go, well, I'm just going to draw all the money out, and then because as much as I'm confident we have reached this end game, and with the show has started, because the source of information is impeccable. They're, a true good friend of mine. I have no doubt to doubt their integrity. We never know. We could turn around in a month's time, and I'd have to say, hang on, the brakes have been put on this, and we're back to a holding position for X number of months. I think that's highly unlikely, but it's still a possibility. So it's difficult. Don't start drawing all your money out the bank. I mean, you could try and put it in a credit union, for example, which might be a better alternative, but will they survive as well? Truthfully, I don't know. So it is a difficult situation to manage, and I appreciate people's concern as to protecting their wealth, but ultimately, gold and silver really are the only tangible assets to protect your wealth.
Mm-hmm. I was chatting to a friend last night who just returned from a trip to Sweden, and he was saying he found it really difficult to comprehend what was going on there, because wherever you went, whether it was in a cafe or a bar or anywhere like that, they didn't want cash. Just a beer and a coffee for his wife, couldn't pay with cash, they wouldn't take it. Everything had to be plastic. That we'd been told there's this push going on towards a cashless society, and we see it with those RFID chips in our bank cards now. Surely that would make bailing in the banks quite easy. If we've got no access to actual physical cash or those promissory notes, then they can do what the hell they like, because they've got control of the computer systems. Yeah,
that's true, but the cashless society is an interesting proposition, but there's something that counteracts that theory pretty well. We all know, ultimately, that one of the cabal's biggest paydays is the drugs industry. That's, irrefutable. Now, the only way the drug industry can work on the street and people buy them and sell them is with cash. Now, if you were to have a cashless society, the drugs industry would collapse, and with it, so would the cabal, one of the cabal's major financial weapons of tyranny. That, and along with the oil industry. So the notion that cash will disappear, well, obviously now, given where we are, this is not going to happen. But there was a lot of talk about that, but that alone would suggest to me that will never happen. Now, obviously what's happening in Sweden, that's interesting because I can't comment because obviously I don't know, but obviously if we have, and there's one or two people on my Facebook page from Sweden, if they can shed some light as to why that's happening. But, I had an interesting experience recently in Holland that apart from the train stations, if I tried to use any bank cards, they were always refused. I could never pay for anything. And I contacted my bank and they said, no, there's no problem. You're authorised. You informed us, because I always do that. You go into a certain country and you can use the card. But I couldn't pay for anything. So I had to pay with cash. There was no other way of doing so. Now, that in itself poses the question, well, why was I not allowed to do international transactions? Because it certainly wasn't from a UK perspective. So you do hear all these stories and have personal experiences. But as for why in Sweden they wouldn't take cash, I don't know. That's a puzzle. I mean, does it suggest that they're concerned that the financial system will collapse so quickly, or the banks may shut, that they'd rather digitally have the money already rather than maybe having to take all tomorrow's takings to the bank to find it's closed? I don't know. It's a bit of a puzzle as to why that's the case, but I'll do a bit of investigating and see if we can find out more why that's happening. But I don't think this is, a lot will be said it's to do with a cashless society, but I suspect it's not to do with that. I suspect it's to do with some huge issues and problems within their financial system. And we've seen that in the UK in recent months, where banks, you can't go to an ATM at the weekend, you can't draw any money out, and they're telling us it's a technical glitch. Well, from my experience, that is absolutely not the case. That's just a way of trying to fool the general public that, oh, it was a computer problem. It absolutely isn't, because those safeguards are in place to ensure that doesn't happen. So clearly there's something else going on.
Well, wouldn't it make no difference whatsoever anyway, even if it was a cashless society, as opposed to a cash society, because the value of the currency is still going to be down. So it doesn't matter if you've got a piece of paper in your hand that says 50, or it's on a computer screen, the value of that 50 is still down. So it's still...
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't make any difference. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes no difference to the real intrinsic value of a currency. But as I say, just from the drugs industry alone, it would kill it stone dead. Well, the cabal aren't going to bite off the hand that feeds them, although obviously this is largely going to become academic. And might be something worth raising the point here that I did make a post recently on my page to do with sort of global things and what was going on, and what has been said to me on 2 or 3 occasions in the last few weeks is that the entire drugs cartel and the industry is going to be smashed into a million pieces, and once particularly the US cabal's dealt with, then that industry is going to collapse and it will no longer function. Well, that's going to pose some interesting questions as to what happens in the future in that respect, but it's been stated quite clearly that these drug cartels, particularly like the Latin American ones, for example, and I guess the opium that comes out of Afghanistan, etc., is going to be curtailed, and it will be the end of them, and these cartels will be destroyed.
So how are they going to stop the trafficking of the opium out of Afghanistan?
Well, I guess we know that basically in Afghanistan the US military protects the poppy fields. Well, once the purse strings of the US military are cut and financially they don't have any more money, the US military will all go home and say, well, we can't operate here anymore, and then they'll be able to move in and stop the supply of heroin, which we know has grown massively since the US invaded Afghanistan. And I'm no fan of the Taliban for obvious reasons, but they were the principal reason why the heroin trade collapsed coming out of Afghanistan. It's no surprise that the time the US went into Afghanistan, they were economically on a knife edge of total collapse, and suddenly all their economic indicators shot through the roof within 12 months of their invasion of Afghanistan. Well, no prizes for guessing it was related to the opium trade.
Mm.
It sounds on paper like a ludicrous conspiracy theory to say that the government is so involved in the drug trafficking and it relies on it so much. But you just have to look at mainstream articles after mainstream articles over the years saying the financial system would collapse if it wasn't for the drug trade.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's it sounds incredulous to most people to believe. But if I'd have said to you 2 or 3 or 4 even months ago that we now have definitive proof of Turkey's involvement in oil smuggling with ISIS, people would have said, no, this is nonsense. Turkey is a NATO country. We can't have a NATO country involved in this activity. Well, it's proven now. It's the conspiracy theorists have scored a goal, and this will continue to happen in the future, where the notion of conspiracy theory being nonsense is proving to be true. But if you want to extend that, there are NATO bases used as part of the drug trafficking out of Afghanistan, and this is irrefutable. It's known to be true, and people say, well, that's a conspiracy theory, where's the proof? Well, in due course, all this will become more and more apparent that, in fact, this is a reality. So people need to be prepared to be, even people who are awake should be aware of the fact that they're going to be quite surprised by a lot of things that come out in the future, and nations that have been involved in these activities. And, of course, we know ISIS is a great example that has been financed, has been armed, and training provided by the West, by NATO. That's irrefutable, because we saw the example in 48 to 72 hours that what Russia did that the Western alliance couldn't do in 2.5, 3 years. They dealt with the problem, and of course, that irrefutably proved the fact the West was doing nothing to inhibit the progress of ISIS. Well, why would they? Because they put them in to destabilise the Middle East and try and redraw the map of the Middle East according to how the cabal wanted it done probably 100 years ago. Of course, that's now miserably failed, and they've not succeeded. And that was one of the big indications that the cabal were on the ropes and finished, because, would you have ever expected Russia to effectively tell America to leave Syria, and they were no longer allowed to do what they had been doing, and now Russia was taking over, and they would in future be dealing with ISIS, and the Americans essentially did exactly that, which shows as well that the US military, I'm not saying that we're going to get into that sort of situation of good guys and bad guys, but the American military certainly just left, and there was no contention as to the fact that Russia was now taking the dominant position, not aggressively, but in dealing with a terrorist outfit. I think even the cabal had lost control.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned Turkey there, Paul, because there was something really odd which I've not been able to have a chat with you about since I saw it happen, and it really struck me as quite bizarre considering what had been happening recently. We've been seeing throughout this year Turkey forging really strong links with Russia financially and economically, and then suddenly they shoot a Turkish jet out the sky. That to me seemed very, very strange.
You mean a Russian jet?
Sorry, they shot a Russian jet out the sky, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that doesn't add up.
Well, no, it doesn't, but more often than not, there's the explanation's pretty basic. What essentially it was an order from Washington to try and provoke Russia. They tried it in Ukraine and failed. And what they were doing, they were trying to provoke Russia into a military response. Of course, Russia and Putin being the way they all went, do you really seriously think we're going to start World War III? And by the way, World War III will never happen. I don't want anybody fearing that that's still... That's talking about stable doors, that one was shut a long time ago and has long since been prevented. But, yeah, Washington said, shoot this aircraft down, and the order was carried out. And, of course, Russia has said to Turkey, well, we're not going to militarily attack you, but economically and politically we'll destroy you. So they immediately imposed sanctions. And now we're seeing where Erdogan's now in a panic station because he now realises what's being done and his very future depends on it. So he's running to Russia going, oh, I'm very sorry, it was a pilot error. And whereas a couple of weeks ago he was all full of bullish rhetoric because he thought he had the support of the cabal, and this shows the weakness of the cabal because they're no longer supporting him. So he's now going back to Russia going, I'm very sorry, what can we do to restore relations between Ankara and Moscow? I don't think he'll survive. I still think Russia will take out action against Turkey. We're likely to see Turkey as a nation broken up. Certainly regions will return to the Kurds, who now Russia are backing in northern Iraq, who want their homelands, including part territory within Turkey, to be restored to what it used to be. So Turkey faces a very uncertain future.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. We're back on air now with Paul and Tom. That was my internet connection, unfortunately, dropping out. So let's blame Sky Broadband for that. But hopefully, I've got converted over to fibre. But that's the good news. The bad news, it's not been activated till the 5th of January. So we'll keep on soldiering on. Paul, when we dropped, we were talking about the shoot down of the Russian Su-24 over the Turkish border. And one thing I was asking as we dropped off, Erdogan would said he would resign if there was any proof of this oil trading between Turkey and ISIS. Yet that proof seems to have been provided by the Russian intelligence. Yet that's completely been ignored. Where do you see that going now?
Well, obviously we know it's true. You know, the proof is irrefutable. Erdogan's just desperately trying to stay in power, probably not because he wants to, but probably because being a cabal puppet, he's being told he's got to stay in charge for the foreseeable future. Because when Erdogan goes, the cabal's grip will disappear because there are enough factions within Turkey who've had enough of what's going on. They know they're a vassal US cabal state, so undoubtedly he's hanging on for grim death. But I've noticed today there's been Turkish MPs who have publicly announced that Turkey was behind some of the sarin that was exported to Syria in 2013. So Turkey's up to its neck in all sorts of horrendous activities associated with the cabal. So undoubtedly Erdogan probably wants to go, but he's probably not allowed to, which is why he's done this ridiculous U-turn. I might venture to suggest that, in fact, he said, oh, I'll go if it's proved to be true, because he knew full well it was true, but obviously subsequently he's been told, no, you don't. You're not going anywhere. And obviously not entirely sure where we got cut off, but the issue of why Turkey wants to cozy up to Russia is because it knows that Russia's important in the future development of the world, but obviously being a vassal state of the cabal, Washington ordered the jet to be shot down, and because they wanted to provoke Putin again militarily, which of course he wouldn't do. And he then immediately imposed economic sanctions, which ultimately would cause huge political damage. And now we're seeing Erdogan going, oh, please, can we renegotiate our position? I'm terribly sorry, one of our pilots made an error and shot your plane down.
Well, it's like you say, it's a massive bullet in their own feet. They're shooting themselves in the foot because of the massive connection with Russia. That's why Putin came out and said, hang on a minute, this is a massive stab in the back. He seemed, when he did that first interview, like he was just completely shocked that they would just shoot themselves in the foot like that, because they know they're so financially entwined with all the tourism and all of the trade in between them. So it's obvious that Russia are going to cut that off, and then it's just going to throttle Turkey. So it makes no sense. But it does make sense that the order came from Washington to provoke Russia. It's not the first time that they've done that. In the Kosovo crisis, we landed with troops. The Russians landed with troops as well. The Russians took over an air base, and the Americans told the UK commander to take over that airport that the Russians have already took over. And he just marched into the American tent and went, screw you, no. I'll start World War III, pal. But it seems Turkey weren't that smart.
Well, no. Well, the problem is it's how entwined within the cabal structure these nations are. It's rather like when Japan refused to do what the cabal wanted, so they engineered Fukushima. It's just, there are big prices to pay for these nations when they defy their master, so to speak. And Saudi is another example of the reason Saudi was a vassal state, apart from stealing all the real wealth and the oil. It kept the House of Saud, propped their regime up. And now we're seeing that the House of Saud probably will collapse very, very soon. And ironically, their involvement in Yemen might well turn out to be their Vietnam. I suspect that probably will be the case, but the days are numbered for them, and they're another vassal state. Of course, once the cabal collapses, the House of Saud will just disintegrate within probably days or weeks at the most, because the mechanism that's kept them in power will
Yeah, what I was going to ask is, what do you make of Turkey's moves in northern Iraq? They have a bunch of troops stationed there with tanks. Iraq's threatening to bomb them to defend its borders. Do you see that as another thing that's been ordered by America to provoke Iraq, the government? Because obviously they put that government in as a puppet government, but it doesn't seem to be much of a puppet to the US anymore.
No, absolutely. And of course, we know that Russia has agreed to support the Kurds in northern Iraq as well, or in that region in terms of defending their borders. So it is, clearly it's another provocation which will fail, and Turkey will eventually just walk with its tail between its legs out and go, we're not doing this anymore. And this is something where we talk about seeing little catalytic events of things happening. That's probably something, that region, the whole Middle East is kind of where essentially the political war's being fought at the moment, and the military war's being fought clearly. For a time it was Ukraine, but Ukraine's largely disappeared. I mean, we don't hear anything about the Ukraine anymore because essentially whatever was going on there is, I mean, there are odd sporadic instances of problems, and I'm not in any way detracting from that and suggesting they're not serious, but it's not the conflict it was by any stretch of the imagination. So, yeah, the Middle East really was where the cabal wanted to redraw the map and create these caliphites, essentially take control of Syria because of its oil and because of the ability to put pipelines through it, and strategically it was important. But I think, I don't often talk about this as a nation, but I think at this point it's probably worth mentioning about Israel, and only for one reason, because it's been deathly quiet while all this has been going on. They've said absolutely nothing about what Russia are doing. They clearly know Russia has been invited to deal with problems in Iraq. They know it in Afghanistan. They're involved in Syria. I mean, the Golan Heights has been a long-standing issue between Syria and Israel. I think undoubtedly that will be returned to Syria. And we're not seeing any noises coming from Israel whatsoever, and we do know that Putin and Netanyahu have had meetings. And I think this climb down from Israel is quite significant. I don't expect to see any big upsurge in rhetoric from them either. I think they are on the downward slope. And I think Israel very much is now isolated. And I think this probably could be another example of how the cabal are in retreat. It's not obvious, but I'd have expected Israel of a year ago, 5 years ago, to be far more bullish in their statements and kind of threatening and overtures to Russia, and they've said absolutely nothing.
What do you make of that, to expand on that, actually, the Israel's pretty much non-involvement in the situation with ISIS, or the situation that's going on, like you say, with Russia? Would you say that Israel is happy to be isolated because they're safe?
Well, yes and no. I think to some extent they probably now realise that the cabal is in retreat. They're not going to have the support. I understand that Netanyahu's been wanting the US military to prop them up with even huger amounts of financial investment, and that's been declined. So he realises he's weak relatively in terms. If you look at them as a nation, I mean, they are very, very exposed to the nations around them, but being isolated from their Western allies clearly is a very precarious to be. But the whole Palestinian question will come up again, undoubtedly. But in the future, I think we will see, and it sounds pretty unbelievable, but I think we will see lands that belong to Palestine restored to them. I think we'll see the Golan Heights be restored to Syria, and we will see some huge changes in Israel. And as with all these situations, we have to feel sorry for the people of these nations. They've been manipulated, lied to, in ways that is just beyond our comprehension. I mean, we're as guilty of having that kind of ideology and propaganda foisted on us as well. But we have to think of the people in these nations. These aren't the problem. It's the lunatics running these countries who've been the problem. And once humanity globally realises that it's been one big divide and conquer agenda that needs to stop, then we can start the process of rebuilding the world. And people may call me idealistic, but I actually believe when we go through this period of turbulence or incredibly ugly times, as was conveyed to me, when we get out the other side, the world will change, and we'll look back in years to come, and the only question we'll have is, how the hell did we ever let this happen? How could we be so easily manipulated into believing that there were nations on this planet who were demonized, who actually weren't doing an eighth of the things that we were told, but it was all part of that agenda to have us hating each other. Because who were the beneficiaries? Or was the cabal?
Well, wouldn't this situation be just like scoring a goal for Israel? This is the ideal scenario, what we're seeing played out across the world, the rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump and various people across the globe. It's almost a
idea. It's a bit like saying that the IRA in Ireland were defenders of Catholicism. It's just absolute nonsense. I mean, these terrorist organisations just hijack a religion because they think it's a convenient banner with which to justify their actions. So yeah, to portray people, the whole idea of that nations are brainwashed into believing that Islam as a religion is a problem, or Muslim people are a problem, is just a joke. Every nation throughout this world has people who are a problem. They have no affiliation to religion. They may hijack it. They have no affiliation to anything. They're largely put in place to destabilise nations, destabilise relations with other nations. They don't represent the masses of people who largely just want to get on it with life in a peaceful way, get on with their neighbours, and just get their head down and do what they have to do. And that is the problem. So yeah, it's always very convenient. I mean, we've seen throughout the history, way beyond the last century and going back hundreds of years, how religion, in inverted commas, has been used as an excuse to wage war and conflict and divide people across the globe. And that's got to end. It's just nonsense.
Well, it's so easy to spook Americans generally as a public because they're such a young country and they're not used to any inland terrorism like we're used to in the UK or European nations are used to. So that people like Donald Trump can just feed off that and say things like that and go massively up in the polls because they're so easy to manipulate because they're such a young country. People don't realise that they're such a young country without much history at all. So that it's easy to spook you, easy to control.
Well, yes, that's true. But I mean, of course, the US has been the cabal's playground. It's been the most manipulated nation politically, environmentally. I mean, GMO started there, the chemtrail program started there. We can go on forever listing how. And the US nation is the least democratic on the planet. It's not some great nation. It could have been a great nation, and one day it will be a great nation, and it'll be so much more beneficial to the world to have a true democratic America which can fulfill its role and its place in the world. And I'm confident those times will come again. But in the short term, the US faces a lot of challenges. As you say, it hasn't had the internal problems. But if we do see these kind of incredibly ugly events, then it's going to pose a lot of challenges for the US and its people because they're not used to having these problems within their own nation. I mean, world wars were fought never in the US. I mean, when do we ever see a war happen in the US apart from the Civil War, etc.? But there's never been invading nations going into America and fighting wars. Well, I mean, to an extent that's true of the UK, but we were involved in World War II, okay, and World War I. They were never actually fought on our soil, but it was as close as it could be, and quite easily Germany could have invaded the UK and taken control. So this is something the US does face, and it's going to be very, very challenging. But in the long term, yes, I'm confident they can recover as a nation. And the people of America need to realise Russia and China want a strong United States, but it wants it without the cabal, and it wants the people within that nation to be able to flourish the way they should always have done. And that's clearly, the American dream is anything but that. As I think the comedian Carlin once said, you'd have to be asleep to believe it. And exactly that, it's a dream, it's not reality.
Well, it's so silly when the American founding fathers warned them against everything that they're doing now. And the people can't see that. A lot of the people in America can't see that. And they're all fluent in the founding father stuff. When I've talked to Americans when I've been in America, they're all fluent in it, but they still can't see that that's what they're doing. They're giving up freedom for security. The famous Benjamin Franklin quote.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly what Trump's coming out with now. That sort of rhetoric is giving up freedom for security, but they can't see that. Even veterans, I've got American military veterans who support Trump throughout everything that he said. I agree with him on certain subjects, but they'll support him throughout. And I was on a massive argument with one veteran the other day. I'm saying, this is too far. You know you're giving up freedom for security. No, it's more than a religion. It's like, wow, you really bought into this.
Well, interestingly, and I have said this publicly, that provided the cabal don't get to Trump, I've been told he's very likely to be the next US president. Now, that could be an interim president while the nation rebuilds or what the situation is, but that is perceived to be very likely. The case now, whether Trump's rhetoric stays the same or changes as a result of that, but you're absolutely right. We've got to get away from this idea that we're using cabal institutions and cabal rhetoric, which is all about divide and conquer. It's in America's interest to try and rebuild its relations with the nations that really, truthfully hate them. Not the people, of course, let's be absolutely clear about that, but they hate the administration for what they've done to them. And in recent years, we've seen that in Libya, Iraq particularly. Whether people like Gaddafi or don't like him, the nation was in a far better position than it is now. So that's the important role. But I'm confident we'll see the Americans, as a nation, their people will respond to the challenge. But there will be a period of time when there's going to be great shock for many people who aren't really aware of anything that's going on. But equally, that applies to the UK or Germany, Holland, anywhere else for you, like in the Western world. There's going to be a lot of the population who are going to be in for a great deal of surprise and shock and awe as to what is really been going on with their nations, not just domestically but internationally.
I mean, it's so easy to jump on the bandwagon of saying, the Americans are dumb, and people have said that in the chat room. And from my experience of talking to Americans, they're not dumb. They just don't have any context of history because they've learnt their own history, which is very short. They need to be learning world history. So they've got no context when it comes to these sorts of things because they've had no experience in the history. They've had no relatives in the past who've gone through it, so they can look back. That's what we have in Europe. They don't have that in America.
No, that's true, and you're absolutely right. It's just a gross insult to label a nation of people as dumb. It's just ridiculous.
Well, it's so silly when you're talking about 350 million people.
No, there's many great, the US has a lot of people who have great ideas now that can't get those ideas off the ground. And I think there's an underbelly in the country of really strong, fiercely patriotic, but in a good way, who will say, right, we're going to position in terms of the reserve currency, and you exported your debt globally, and as a result, waged countless wars just to conquer nations. And, we're back to my unholy trinity of death, destruction, and grand larceny. That's how the cabal operate. That's exactly what they've always done. In every nation they go into who defies them, that's precisely what they do. And even the ones who don't defy them, less of the death, less of the destruction, but they still steal. They steal huge amounts of money through, in the Saudis' case, the Saudi gets a fraction of the revenue from every barrel of oil they sell. The rest of it went to the cabal through some convoluted network via Japan of all places. Well, no surprise, because Japan's a vassal.
On the ISIS situation, and becoming somewhat part of the coalition, not part of the same coalition, but there are major talks with Russia where they didn't exist. The West are getting at the table with Putin, which we didn't see before.
Yeah, I think we'll look back in history. I remember Minsk too, which was the whole Ukraine thing where Putin met with Hollande and Merkel. I saw that one day when we found out the truth of what happened there, that was a big defining turning point. I think the terrorist attack in Paris recently was another big defining point because that probably backfired on the cabal more than anything else that they've been involved in. The French were shocked, horrified by what happened. By all accounts, they had no idea it was going to happen. No people say, false flag attack. Well, yes, it might be, but not with the consent of the French government. So I think that was when France changed and Britain started to then cooperate France, and there was more of a unified thinking over how they're handling issues to do with ISIS in Syria. Yes, we've seen the British government say, well, we voted to go in and bomb Syria, but unless I'm mistaken, I haven't really heard them doing an awful lot of bombing or many comments said about them, and certainly we've heard nothing to suggest that they have actually been doing that much. I'm not, any life lost is wrong. I mean, I'm not going to start suggesting that I, condoning any terrorist activity, but any loss of life has repercussions, and particularly any loss of innocent life. And undoubtedly, all these missions that Russia or any other nation take, there are going to be innocent casualties, very sadly, but unfortunately that's what is going to happen. But I do think we are seeing, I agree, that Paris was a turning point where it became, these nations are now operating from a cabal perspective in Syria. I think we know very much Russia is in charge. Is how much cooperation is going on difficult to know, but what we're also seeing is, I think, is a fracture and breakup of NATO, because France certainly unilaterally took action in Syria. Germany's also taking action, which is kind of interesting, seeing as Germany, from what I understand, it's illegal for them to have any military operations outside their borders, which has been imposed since the end of World War II, but they just defied that and are involved. We're also seeing the UK involved, and I think this is a defiant gesture that's showing that NATO as an alliance is crumbling, and we know that NATO is a big cabal organisation ultimately.
Well, it seemed, I'd agree with you, your perspective on what's happened, and it seems like a massive embarrassment for the West, especially with Russia, like you said, doing more in 2 months than the West have done in years. And France did backfire, obviously. It seems like a Frankenstein monster to me, that they create these monsters of ISIS and then they get out of control because they're not doing the task that they want them to do, to take over countries and then install what they want. It didn't work in Libya. It hasn't worked in Syria. It certainly can work to stop an opposing force coming into the country like they did with the Mujahideen, but it certainly doesn't work to take over a country. I'm so angry that they're calling Libya a failed state when it wasn't a failed state in the first place until we took action in there.
No, absolutely, and it was an inevitable consequence that, the Arab Spring was part of the engineered cabal plan to redraw the map of the Middle East and North Africa. And Libya was the first state. They tried it in Egypt, and they had some success, and then Egypt overthrew the so-called Muslim Brotherhood, who was cabal, and they've now got a leader in and a government who's cozying up to Russia, and Russia's very much protecting them. And once again, Egypt's on Israel's doorstep. They have not had great relations on and off over the years, but there was nothing said about that, and Russia is very much protecting Egypt in terms of military protection, but also they've got trade deals and they're kind of working together. But obviously the difference is Russia doesn't do it from an aggressive standpoint. It's doing it from a benign standpoint, but it's making a point that you're not going to redraw the boundaries of the Middle East how you want to. And Syria was obviously a huge nation. This idea, we're doing it because, Assad, he's a bad man, he's doing horrible things to his people. Well, anyone who levels that question to me, I always say, okay, if that may be so, and we can debate that, but tell me why the West alliance has never gone into Zimbabwe and dealt with Mugabe. If anyone wants to research Zimbabwe and find out what Mugabe did to that nation and its people, then you know full well that it's utter nonsense of the premise of why they're in Syria and to remove Assad. They only want to remove Assad because he won't bow to the cabal financial system and he won't do what they want him to do. And also, fortunately, from Assad's perspective, and this is purely looking at it from his perspective, he's had Russia as a very strong ally, which refused to allow the West to prevail in that nation. So, if anyone wants to argue about preserving the interest of people, just ask them why they've allowed Mugabe to do what he did in Zimbabwe, because it is beyond the pale to understand what has actually gone on there. And nobody has done anything about it.
I've had so many arguments with people who you would say were in the mainstream of media on Facebook, or look at mainstream media and nothing else, about Russia, and the same thing comes up all the time. Because we're getting a bit closer to Russia now, and through embarrassment, in my opinion, we're getting close to them now on what's going to happen in Syria. They're saying, "Oh well, I can't believe that we're joining forces with Russia. Putin's a scumbag. He invaded the Ukraine and Crimea." And every time I'll just put, how many countries has the UK got left to invade? Look that up on Google, my friend. 22. We've got
quite
left
and,
to invade.
The Crimea is just a farcical thing because they voted overwhelmingly to want to cede to Russia. And the only reason the West cared about it is because strategically it's important in the Black Sea. And when, of course, then we saw how Ukraine switched off the electricity supply. And look how quickly Russia have got it online. They put a second line in today. It's operational. And the Crimean people are passionately Russian and wanted to cede to Russia. And the West denounced this as though that's totally unacceptable behaviour for a democracy to express its will. But by the way, we're quite happy to go march into Iraq and depose people and do what we want because it doesn't suit us that those leaders are in charge because they're not doing what we want them to do anymore. But, if you want to use Gaddafi as an example, why did they allow him to do what he did for 40 years if he was such a bad man? But then suddenly he was a very bad man and we had to get rid of him. And that's it's always the context. If people want to ever understand what's going on, rather than listening to what you're told, always take a step back and say, okay, why is this happening now? The timing is always critical. It always gives you largely an indication as to what's really going on. Libya.
The Saddam weapons of mass destruction. Where did he get those weapons of mass destruction from? Look up a video on our page on YouTube. I took it from a documentary. It was when they blew up Saddam's weapons of mass destruction in the first Gulf War. And look on the side of those boxes. Some of them say, made in Middlesex, England.
Exactly. Well, it's rather like, people all complain about ISIS. Okay, so here's the question. Where does the oil that ISIS steals, which everybody, the Western media is quite happy to go, yeah, ISIS is stealing all this oil. Who are they selling it to? And who's providing them all their arms from the proceeds? And I've not seen one mainstream media person even comment on that. They're the obvious questions, and this is why, if anyone has any doubts that the mainstream media is a problem, then there's just two obvious questions. That, until we get those kind of clear-cut, straightforward answers to obvious questions, then the mainstream media is a massive problem.
Noel in the chat room's asking,
which we obviously understand and realise, but politically and militarily and in the new paradigm, as I refer to it, the Renaissance nation is Russia. And Russia is not intent on dominating countries. It doesn't want to impose its will. If it had really wanted to impose its will, it could have marched through to Kiev in 2 days, taken Ukraine over and said to the West, go away. But no, it didn't. It did the exact opposite because it has no interest in occupying Ukraine, but also because it realised that Ukraine was another kind of Waterloo/Vietnam for the cabal, which is why they sat back and didn't get involved. But no, there was a time, we can look back in history when Russia had its expansion through Eastern Europe and formed the Iron Curtain, and we can look at how they got sucked into Afghanistan, into a war. But that was a long time ago. That was a whole different world. I mean, Russia is not the nation it was since 2000 when Putin took power. The country's changed. It knows it's not perfect. It's got a long way to go, and it's still got things it needs to address. But it is doing the right things, and it doesn't have any intent on a world stage. It's far too intelligent to realise that where the Americans fail is every country they ever tried to go in and occupy. It fails. You can't do it. It will never succeed. But of course, unfortunately, the cabal also have realised to their cost and to our benefit that in fact that was a failed strategy.
Well, I think you're completely right, especially with the Ukraine. Obviously, Russia have an interest in instability in the Ukraine. They don't want any instability on the doorstep, so they have an interest there. Well, funny enough, I work with a Russian guy, and he gave me a lift into work one morning. And I said, well, what do you think of what's going on in the Ukraine? Well, this was at the height of when Sky News and all the Western media were basically saying we're going to World War III, and then RT were just laughing at all the reports. And he said, and bearing in mind the Russian guy I work with, he has no interest either way with Putin. He's not a fan. He's not against him at all. And he says, I've been looking at both sides and talking to his Russian friends and talking to friends in the Ukraine. It's one thing you've got to understand, that the Ukrainians are very good at manipulating things and making things out to be false, to be real, but are actually false. Especially with something that I saw, where the Western media were reporting that Russian tanks had rolled into the Ukraine, and he was laughing at that himself. He said they zoomed in and it was actually just cars. It was Russian cars. Well, the Ukraine's full of Russian cars, obviously. But,
exactly.
I mean, with the crime, obviously Russia's interested in sorting out any instability on its doorstep, and obviously it's going to secure its own section of the Ukraine, which was the Crimea. I always said throughout, and I said afterwards, it was like saying, oh, we've invaded Gibraltar, or we've invaded the Falkland Islands. They were already British. The Crimea was already Russian. They already had the right to station troops there because it's the Black Sea base.
Mm-hmm.
And 90% of the population, like you said, voted to become part of Russia because they classified themselves as Russia. Do you see anybody complaining in the Crimea?
No, very few people. Absolutely, and that is kind of it in a nutshell. So, if Russia and China wanted to impose their will on nations the way the Western propaganda suggests, they could have easily done it and would have had no problem doing it. But they're not doing that. I mean, and I've talked about this from the first radio interview we did about where it gets levelled at Putin's cabal. Well, I hope now anybody who thinks that after what the action we've seen in Syria should have no doubt whatsoever now that is simply not the case. Because if he was cabal, he would never have gone in and done what the Western cabal-controlled nation should have done. And, well, apart from the fact they should never have allowed ISIS to be created in the first place for their own ends, but his actions there prove categorically he is not cabal. He has no interest in the cabal, and he wants the cabal destroyed as much as the rest of us do, because the world will be a far better place once they're gone. And we come full circle to the communication I read out at the start of the show, and that is absolutely the position, that the cabal has to go in its entirety. But this isn't about ultimately going, well, I want retribution for what they've done. I know people are furious at what they've done, and I'm no less. I'm furious at what they've done. But if we're going to build a world in the future, we've got to focus less on the retribution side. They will pay, whoever they are, whatever they've done. They'll have to pay for the consequences of their action. But going forward, we need to forget about that to some extent and focus on the world as we want it to be, because we have an opportunity finally to rebuild a world how we'd like it to be. And this is for future generations. It's not just about people of my age or any other age for that matter. It's for their children, grandchildren, and so on. And this is building a legacy that in the future we can look back on and say this was the defining turning point when the world really changed, and it's no longer a dream, it's a reality.
Well, I think people are scared. They haven't got so much trust in Russia or China, their system being better or it being a good outcome when it does take over the financial system. How would you address that?
Well, no, they're not going to impose their will. I mean, I would suggest to anyone, go and visit, go to Russia, go to China. I've been to these countries. They are not how you would imagine they are. Yes, they have their problems. Yes, they've had corruption, and the corruption's been rooted out. I mean, I put a post upon my Facebook page about the amount of so-called bankers, in inverted commas, who've disappeared in China, been arrested, removed. They're cleaning up their nation. They're ridding the corruption, which ironically is largely Western-based. The West has tried to infiltrate these nations heavily, largely now without success, and that's diminishing, obviously, on a day-to-day basis. But no, they're not interested in dominating nations, but they're going to protect their own nations for sure. But does anyone seriously imagine that we're going to have this situation where Russia and China are going to send invading forces to take control of the US? I mean, in a country that's, 3.8 million square miles? This is just nonsense. They would never do that. What would be the point in doing that? They don't want to control nations. They don't need to. And the military angle is a cabal tactic. And the problem is we in the West are so used to that. We don't see any other option but, it's got to be military conquest, and that's how they'll achieve their aims. Absolutely not, and from a financial perspective, no. They're encouraging their people to buy gold and silver to protect their future wealth and investment. They're encouraging that in their people. In the West, we're encouraged to do exactly the opposite. Why we'll keep saying, sell your gold to us, we'll give you a good price. We've seen those adverts since 2008, ironically. Well, no prizes for guessing why that's the case. So there's no interest from them financially or militarily to dominate nations. Yeah, I know China's bought up a lot of the US, but China has done that simply as one process of dumping all their worthless dollars, but also because they want to reindustrialize the United States. Now, people immediately go, hang on, reindustrialization, that doesn't sound like we're getting past the cabal who environmentally destroyed the world. Well, reindustrialization can mean many things. Whether we live in a high-tech world, we're still going to need high-tech equipment that has to be produced. It won't be produced the way it is now, and yes, the oil industry and other, the pharmaceutical industry, the financial industry, their cabal strongholds will all be razed to the ground. It will be the end of them. But things will replace them. So reindustrialization doesn't mean we're going to see dirty, great big smoky chimneys burning coal or the equivalent in the modern era. That simply won't be the case anymore.
Well, it's mostly manufacturing, and that's intrinsic wealth of a country, manufacturing and the industry. So pulling that back gives you national wealth. It's like a monopoly board.
Yeah, and I know people will say, well, I thought in the new world we won't have a financial system and the way it is now. Well, yes, eventually that will be the case, but that's not going to happen overnight. You can't transition a world that says, well, you have a mortgage, you have financial obligations, you have a job, you have to pay for your food, you have to pay this. But by the way, tomorrow we're just going to scrap all that and you're going to have this utopian world where everything will be provided to you. How is that possible? It's not. We have to transition financially, and therefore there will be a period where eventually, yes, money probably as we see it now will disappear. I don't doubt that, but that's not going to happen overnight. It could be a decade away. It might be 20 years away. Doesn't mean the cabal aren't gone. Of course they are, but we still have a financial system. But the word finance has become a dirty word because it's associated with the cabal. It doesn't mean you can't have a financial system that works for everybody. And in the transitional phase, that's exactly what will happen. It will not be the way it is now. And yes, eventually the financial system probably will be largely phased out. We won't have things the way we do now. But always be careful of branding everything a dirty word, because the only reason it's dirty is not because the financial system itself was a problem. It was the lunatics and how they implemented it who were the problem and have given it the dirty word.
Noel in the chat room is asking what should happen to the aggressors in the interviewee's opinion. Should we just let them loose? And the aggressors he's talking about is the cabal, or are the cabal?
No, from my opinion, they forfeited their right to have any influence over humanity. My personal view is, yes, they need to be removed from office. They need to be tried for their crimes. Will that happen? I suspect it will. Will some cabal members want to be arrested? No, some might decide they'd rather end their own lives than face that humiliation. Some may end up in gunfights and be killed. I don't know, but they all will be removed, and they have to end the sphere of absolutely despicable influence over this planet, and that will come. And when they're gone, then it's up to us to fill the vacuum. And this is a big problem that we also have in the world, that we wish the cabal to be gone, and who's going to disagree how they operate. But there's this enormous vacuum that has to be filled. And where are the people to fill that vacuum? I mean, I'll give you an example. Merkel has wanted to go from a position of notional power, albeit as a Washington vassal state as well, in Germany. The Germans can't find anybody to take over. I mean, that's as big a damning indictment of the lack of capable people to actually run the country in the way it should be. This is a problem, and something we need to address and be aware of, that removing the cabal is easy in one sense. The difficult challenge then lies as to who's going to come in and transition countries. And the idea, well, we don't need government and we don't need this. Well, okay, if you don't want government, then don't expect to have any street lights. Don't expect to have any ability to buy food or food to be provided. You have to have governance, but once again, governance become a dirty word because of the cabal. We can have a very different governance that operates in the best interest of all people, of nations and between nations, and that's something we're going to have to transition to. But where are the people in the UK, the US and other nations to assume those roles, to transition nations to what they should be? Do they exist? Well, they might do, but it's not obvious, and that's a problem we're going to also experience in that vacuum that is going to certainly come about when the cabal are gone.
One thing I did want you to clear up tonight was what actually did happen in Iceland. Now, this is portrayed through the alternative media like they arrested a shitload of bangers, they basically cleaned house in Iceland, but it doesn't seem that way when you dig deeper. It doesn't seem that it was so aggressive or so successful as it is portrayed.
Yeah, I think it's a halfway house. Yeah, they certainly did undertake certain measures to remove people from office and try and clean up. And they are trying to implement new financial systems. They have had problems. It's not been as successful. It's a kind of hybrid between where they were and where they need to be. But yeah, there were people arrested, and that's irrefutable. And there's people being charged and subsequently sent to prison. But no, the idea that they've got a financial system that's kind of flourishing in a post-cabal world is not true. But they did take strides to deal with problems, more so than Western nations that did nothing and repeatedly do nothing. We've seen so many financial scandals, one after the other. And there's some token response where a bank gets fined. Oh, well, don't worry that you've been involved in handling drugs money for the Mexican cartel. Well, that's fine, but you naughty boy, you're going to pay 10. All the other things with foreign exchange, currency manipulation, interest rate manipulation, gold price manipulation, everything's manipulated and they haven't dealt with it. Whereas at least to some extent Iceland have gone about trying to address the problem, but they're a long way from where they need to be, but they have made some strides in the right direction, and this is something all Western nations and other nations of the world will have to look to implement in the future.
Noel in the chat room saying thank you for that, but how can we trust any future contenders for government given our experiences of hundreds of years of fraud, corruption and skullduggery? Why do we need a government? Can we not govern ourselves? I'll give a little bit of response to that. Wouldn't the ultimate government be us governing ourselves? It seems to me that we're governed what a lot of people say is we're governed by the least amongst us. In a tribal society, you put the strongest, the most, with the person who you'd want to aspire to at the head of the tribe. We don't do that when we put a government in. We put the least amongst us in the government because basically it's because it's the only choice that we have, because we have a choice of the lesser of two evils or three evils. But the whole system needs changing to a real government, a real government that was on par with what a tribal government originally was.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, once again, we're back to the dirty word of government, but the cabal's been around a lot longer than people realise. They've been around 50 years, 100 years. Well, obviously, depending on nations, but in the UK, they've been around for hundreds of years. And the issue is, until you remove them, then you can have governance. I mean, I'm not trivialising the problems, but the solutions are ridiculously simple. The problem we have is convincing the people in the country that there are solutions that are ridiculously simple. They've been brainwashed into believing that, oh, we can't solve the health service problems. It's impossible. Well, yes, we can. We have Big Pharma, who's the big problem in the health service, because Big Pharma makes huge amounts of money when people are ill. They don't make any money if we're all healthy. That's just one small example. So until we remove the cabal from the power that they actually influence and wield over nations, once they're gone, then we can have governance how we need to be. But if we say, well, we can all govern, how does that work? If I have 50 million people or 60 million people in the UK, and we have 30 million different ideas, how do we implement it? You can't. That doesn't mean it's a dictatorship, but we need to have consensus where people can have elected people who aren't politically orientated. They're there for the benefit of the nation. So they say, okay, how do we handle the financial system? What do we need to do to make it work for people? Well, we need to address X, Y, and Z. Okay, how are we going to implement this? And we also have real party politics in the sense of not the facade we have now where it doesn't exist. The idea Labour and Conservative are different parties is a nonsense. It's an illusion. You're just voting for the same government every time. Who's the cabal? Once that's gone, then we can have better governance. It doesn't mean it's governance the way it is now, and absolutely it won't be, and it shouldn't be. But we do need, to some extent, governance for a period of time. How that's going to evolve will depend on the people. But I think we do need to have some infrastructure and some mechanism in place that supports the well-being of a nation, and individuals cannot do that. They can individually do things for themselves, for sure, and they should be encouraged. People have great ideas, then let's support them to develop a business which employs people. They have, there's a lot of probably very great entrepreneurial people in every nation. Let's encourage that. Let's encourage people who ordinarily wouldn't have the ability to be able to influence and shape events in their country. Give them the opportunity to do that. But we can't have no governance, go from a cabal governance, which is strangling everybody, to no governance. It just isn't possible, because you do need an element of that. Okay? If you don't want any governance, who's going to provide us used to having a government that doesn't care about the nation at all? Literally spits in the face of its people and pretends it's all caring every 5 years when it wants to be re-elected, even though that's a complete illusion. Once that goes away, then there is room for real governance that will work for the benefit of everyone. But I appreciate people can't see that, because none of us have had any experience of that in our lifetime.
It seems to me that people are too used to career politicians and people being put in front of us instead of... I think the old saying goes, he who wants to be a politician should never be a politician. I think if you're a great member of society, you should be pinpointed and say, hang on a minute, you're the leader. It shouldn't be just these stooges that are put up in front of us. But we'll come to the end of the show, so I'll hand it back over to Andy.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. I've had a thought for some time now that I think a good way to move forward in the future, if we can get rid of these psychopathic scumbags, would be to look on representing the people in government almost like a national service. So, okay, you do 6 months each, and after that 6 months, if you like the job and you're popular, you can stay on for a bit longer. But if not, you're out. If you don't particularly like it, or you're not very popular with the people, then you're out. Do you think that's a possible way to go forward?
Yeah, why not? I mean, we can go away from having party politics, and let's elect people who can manage economies, who can manage the health service and education, who are passionate about it and care about it and want to do the right thing. But you're right, put people on probation, and if the nation says, sorry, you're not doing your job, you're out, then get rid of them and find somebody or a group of people who can do that. That's a far more efficient way. But it's still, it requires governance. It's like, even the most altruistic businesses in the world that are really there to do the right things for people, if you don't have some management and some organisation and structure around it, it won't work. It will just collapse and fail. So, why not? Let's try some different things, because we know the present system's failed and it's proved to be failed. And don't be, everyone out there, don't be frightened. If you really think you have some good ideas in the future, then, be vocal about them, talk about them. This is what the new world has to be all about, and it will be about. It's not about individuals. It's not about this hierarchy of controlled everything. It's a completely different paradigm that's going to be about what's beneficial to everybody, and everybody can play their part. Whatever, we all have different abilities and talents, and it gives us an opportunity to exercise those, and that will make a much more rounded world for everybody, as opposed to the world we live in now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that, Paul. We're coming to the end of the show now. Have you got any links you'd like to give out?
Well, I mean, obviously I have the Facebook page, which is called The Sirius Report. That's SIRIUS Report. Obviously we post articles and views on things. We, really happy to have a lot of members recently. We've had a big increase. We thank everyone for joining, but encourage people to join and to be part of it. You can post things, make comments, and it's about the group's not about me. It's all Lisa, who obviously helps greatly behind the scenes. It's about everybody who's in that group, and you make the group. And we've had some great contributions from people, and we'd encourage everyone to contribute and make it a bigger group that everyone becomes aware of, because hopefully things we have discussed have come to pass. So we have some reasonable track record of getting things right, and that's all I can do in the position I am.
That's great.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. And
no, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Really enjoyed it tonight.
Yeah,
likewise. And I think it's a great format. We try to experiment a bit, and I think it's worked. It's worked well.
Thank you very much, Paul. Stay tuned,
folks.
folks.
Thank you both.
We've got Graham Hart coming up at 9 o'clock, hopefully, and that'll be followed by Joanne Summerscales with the Mass Project at 11, and I know tonight she's got Suzanne Hanson on, all the way from New Zealand. And I know Suzanne's fascinating because I saw her over at Homefirth earlier this year. So we'll be back Friday, 7 o'clock, and we've got Mark from the Lug Kitchen in Liverpool will be joining us this week. I'm really looking forward to that one. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone. And we'll play you out with a little bit of Fairground Attraction.